In a quiet neighborhood hidden behind neatly trimmed hedges and rows of almost identical houses, a storm was quietly brewing. On the surface, everything looked picture-perfect. Manicured lawns, white fences, and families going about their daily routines. But deep beneath that calm exterior, the Homeowners Association, the powerful HOA board that ruled this place with an iron fist, had set its sights on one man. That man was a veteran, a black man who had served his country with honor, discipline, and pride. His name carried respect in the outside world. But within this HOA-controlled neighborhood, he was seen as a problem, an outsider who didn't fit in with their vision of a community under strict, suffocating rules. He had moved into his home years ago, believing it would be a quiet place to live out his retirement. A modest house, painted in neutral tones, with an American flag proudly displayed by the front porch. For him, the flag wasn't decoration. It was a reminder of sacrifice, of service, of battles fought far away so that people here could live in peace. But to the HOA, that flag was the first target. The letters began quietly enough. Notices stuffed into his mailbox with polite wording but sharp undertones. Violation, unauthorized flag display. He read them, shook his head, and set them aside. After all, he knew the law. Federal protections gave him the right to fly the American flag on his property. But the board didn't care. They saw his defiance not as a matter of legal right, but as a challenge to their control. Soon, the letters became more frequent. A week didn't pass without some new complaint. They said his pickup truck parked neatly in his own driveway violated community aesthetics. They claimed the shade of paint on his house wasn't within approved color guidelines, despite it being nearly identical to half the houses on the block. They even targeted his loyal dog, arguing that the fence he had installed for it wasn't up to code, even though it matched the very fence his neighbor had put up years before without issue. It was becoming clear. This wasn't about rules. This was personal. Behind closed doors, the HOA board whispered about him. They saw him as a symbol of resistance, someone who wouldn't bow down to their petty demands. And to maintain their grip over the community, they decided to make an example of him. Quietly, fines began stacking up. First $100, then $500, then $1,000. By the time he realized what was happening, the HOA claimed he owed tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid violations. And then came the hammer blow. A notice taped to his door, stamped in bold letters. The HOA was suing him. Worse yet, they were moving to evict him from his own home. The man stood on his porch, notice in hand, the weight of it pressing down on him like a stone. He had fought in deserts and jungles. He had faced enemies who wanted nothing more than to see him fall. Yet somehow this piece of paper from a group of overzealous neighbors felt heavier than all of it, because this was his home, his safe place, his land. And now they wanted to take it away. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some whispered in support, quietly telling him they admired his strength but feared speaking out themselves. Others shook their heads, believing the HOA's lies that he was trouble, that he didn't respect the rules. The board fed this narrative, painting him as the villain in newsletters and community emails. They portrayed themselves as the guardians of order, simply trying to preserve the beauty of the neighborhood. But behind every word, there was venom. The man, however, was not easily broken. He spent late nights at his dining table, papers spread across the wood, reading every notice, every bylaw, every threat they had sent him. He knew something felt off. The way they pushed so hard, the way they seemed desperate to silence him. There had to be something deeper at play. And so, he began to dig. He visited the county records office, pulling dusty files and scanning through old deeds. He spent hours scrolling through legal databases, reading cases where HOAs had overstepped their bounds. He knew the law wasn't always on the side of homeowners, but he also knew that every HOA had weaknesses, loopholes in their paperwork, mistakes in their filings, oversights that could unravel their authority. As he flipped through document after document, frustration grew. The HOA seemed airtight, every paper stamped, every clause neatly written. But he refused to give up. His training had taught him patience. He had learned that the enemy often looked strongest just before they fell. Meanwhile, the HOA ramped up the pressure. They began sending security guards to patrol the neighborhood, stopping by his property, writing false reports of unapproved activity. Neighbors grew uneasy. The man became a ghost in his own community, watched, harassed, pushed toward the edge. And yet, he kept digging. Then, one night, buried in a stack of old documents, he found something. A small, almost invisible oversight. Something so simple, yet so devastating, it stopped him cold. The HOA's original founding paperwork, the very document that gave them power over the neighborhood, had never been properly filed with the county. Without it, their authority was not just weak, it was non-existent. The man leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery hitting him like a wave. For weeks they had pushed him, bullied him, tried to destroy him. But in their arrogance they had built their empire on sand, and now he held the key to bring it crashing down. As the eviction date loomed, the HOA believed they had already won. But the veteran knew better. For the first time since this war began, he smiled. Because this wasn't going to be a battle of survival anymore. This was going to be a trap. A legal trap they would never see coming. The days following his discovery were some of the most intense of his life. On the surface, the HOA tightened its grip with the precision of a noose. Notices arrived daily, each one more aggressive than the last. They claimed his unpaid fines had now ballooned into tens of thousands of dollars, painting him as a delinquent, a stain on the neighborhood. Behind the veil of bureaucracy, though, the man knew the truth. Their power was a facade. But knowledge alone was not enough. He understood that proving it would take more than a casual mention. The HOA had lawyers, resources, and an entire community manipulated into thinking they were invincible. If he stepped into court unprepared, they would drown him in technicalities and procedure until his discovery meant nothing. He needed evidence, he needed strategy, and most of all, he needed patience. Meanwhile, the HOA board moved with arrogance. They believed their campaign of pressure was working. With every letter taped to his door, every fine tacked onto his name, they grew more confident. At community meetings, the board's president stood tall, declaring that the association would not tolerate troublemakers who refused to uphold community standards. She spoke in carefully chosen words, but beneath them was poison. Her speeches were designed to isolate him, to make neighbors see him as the problem, rather than the victims of an overreaching board. And it worked on some. A few neighbors began to cross the street rather than walk past his house. Others whispered rumors, believing the narrative that he was reckless, defiant, unwilling to follow rules. But there were still those who quietly supported him, though fear kept them from speaking out. They nodded in solidarity when no one was looking, slipped kind words when the board wasn't listening, but made no moves to challenge the regime. They too had seen what happened to those who resisted. The man's life turned into a cycle of intimidation. HOA security patrols parked near his driveway, watching him with crossed arms. At night, headlights flashed across his windows, cars slowing just enough to remind him he was being monitored. The board sent contractors to inspect his yard without permission, documenting imaginary violations. It was harassment, plain and simple, but done under the thin disguise of enforcement. Yet through it all, he kept digging. At the county records office, clerks began to recognize him by sight. He spent hours hunched over dusty volumes, flipping through paperwork older than most of the homes in the neighborhood. He studied plats, deeds, and amendments, piecing together the timeline of how the HOA had come into existence. Every shred of paper he collected added weight to his growing arsenal. The flaw he had found, an unfiled document, wasn't just a mistake. It was the foundation stone missing from the entire structure. Without it, every fine, every letter, every so-called authority the HOA had exercised was a house of cards. But he knew courts demanded clarity, proof, and precision. So he gathered copies, notarized statements, and historical filings that built a story the HOA couldn't escape. Still, the board didn't know he had discovered their Achilles heel. They believed he was cornered. They accelerated their assault, filing motion after motion, scheduling hearings meant to exhaust him into submission. The legal fees alone, they thought, would break him. They underestimated the discipline of a soldier. At night, while most of the neighborhood slept, his home glowed with the light of desk lamps. Stacks of binders grew taller, each one labeled with dates, case numbers, and references. His dining room became a war room, every surface covered in paperwork. A veteran of battle, he treated this fight the same way he had treated combat, profound, with focus. This wasn't just his fight anymore, and relentless determination. If he succeeded, he wouldn't just save his own home. He could liberate the entire neighborhood from a regime that had ruled unchecked for years. He could expose the corruption, the bullying, the misuse of power that had turned a peaceful community into a fiefdom. His battle had the potential to change everything, but the HOA was equally relentless. They weren't content with court filings. They began to weaponize the very community against him. Anonymous letters slipped into neighbors' mailboxes, warning them that his defiance would lower property values. The board published newsletters painting him as a man, endangering the harmony of the neighborhood. They framed themselves as the protectors, the veterans of order against a single rogue resident. The veteran read these words and almost laughed. They didn't see what was coming. To them, he was a man losing ground, desperately stalling against the inevitable. To him, they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. One morning, as he walked out to collect his mail, he noticed a new notice taped to his door. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a formal eviction notice, signed and sealed, declaring that his home would be taken from him if he didn't pay the so-called debts. He held it in his hands for a long time, staring at the bold letters. A neighbor across the street watched him quietly, shaking their head with pity. But inside, the man felt no fear. He felt resolve. Because by now, his plan was almost complete. He had spoken with legal aid, studied case law, and even found precedents where HOAs had been dissolved entirely for similar mistakes. His evidence wasn't just a loose thread, it was a wrecking ball aimed directly at the core of their power. And when the time came, he would swing it. Still, the weight of the fight was real. There were moments of doubt, late nights when exhaustion threatened to cloud his focus, the pressure of being watched, of being ostracized, of being painted as a villain. It was heavy. But then he looked at the flag on his porch, the same flag they had once tried to strip from him. A symbol of battles fought and freedoms earned. And he remembered why he couldn't quit. Because if he let them win, it wasn't just his home that would be lost. It was the principle that bullies could take what they wanted, that power could crush truth unchecked, and that he could never allow. As the court date drew near, the HOA grew bolder. Their lawyers filed thick motions full of jargon, confident that the veteran wouldn't understand. But he read every word, dissected every line, and filed responses meticulously. For every punch they threw, he had a counter ready. And then, quietly, he filed his own motion, a motion backed with documents, evidence, and the fatal flaw that would gut their entire case. The HOA didn't see it yet. They believed they were marching toward his eviction, but in reality they were marching toward their own destruction. The man leaned back in his chair one evening, papers spread across the table, and allowed himself a rare smile. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. Now all that remained was to spring it. The morning of the hearing carried a weight unlike any other. The veteran rose early, long before the sun had cut through the mist, his body moving with the same precision it had when he was in uniform. Every document was neatly packed into binders, each page marked with tabs and highlights. The evidence he had collected over months was not just paperwork, it was ammunition. And today, he would fire every shot. When he arrived at the courthouse, the HOA board was already there. They gathered in a cluster outside the courtroom doors, dressed sharply, exuding confidence. Their lawyers stood tall, holding stacks of polished briefs, smirks tugging at the corners of their mouths. To them, this was just another case, another homeowner to be crushed beneath the weight of legal technicalities. They had done it before, and they believed today would be no different. The veteran walked past them quietly, his face unreadable. He wore no tailored suit, only a plain jacket, but he carried himself with the calm dignity of a man who had seen real battles. While the HOA thrived on intimidation, he thrived on discipline. He didn't need to prove his worth with appearances. The truth in his files would speak louder than any expensive attorney. Inside, the courtroom filled with a quiet tension. The judge entered, stern and deliberate, taking her seat. The bailiff called for order. On one side sat the HOA, represented by a team of attorneys, their briefcases gleaming. On the other sat the veteran, alone but composed, his binder of documents neatly stacked before him. The HOA's lead attorney began confidently. He painted a picture of a stubborn man who had ignored community rules, accumulated massive debts, and resisted every attempt at resolution. With practiced eloquence, he described the veteran as a disruptive presence, a danger to the harmony of the neighborhood. He cited violations, fines, and contracts, building what appeared to be an airtight case. The judge listened carefully, her eyes sharp, her pen jotting notes. The attorney spoke for nearly an hour, his voice carrying authority, his presentation filled with polished exhibits. By the time he finished, the HOA board was smiling smugly, certain they had secured victory before the veteran even spoke. Then it was his turn. The veteran stood slowly, his hands steady as he carried his binder to the podium. He did not raise his voice, did not rely on theatrics. He simply began to lay out the truth. He acknowledged the HOA's claims, admitted that notices had indeed been taped to his door, that fines had been issued. But then he pulled out the first critical document, a certified copy of the county's record showing the HOA had never properly filed its declaration of authority. The room shifted. The judge leaned forward, scanning the paper carefully. The attorneys for the HOA exchanged uneasy glances. The veteran continued, methodical and precise. He presented the timeline. The original deed to his land. The failed filing from decades ago. The legal requirements that had been ignored. He explained how every fine, every notice, every act of enforcement was built upon an authority that legally did not exist. As he spoke, he could see the confidence drain from the HOA's faces. The smugness turned into confusion, then into alarm. Their attorneys whispered frantically, flipping through their own binders, searching for a counter that didn't exist. The veteran didn't stop there. He introduced case precedents, court rulings from other states where HOAs had been dissolved under similar circumstances. He presented affidavits from clerks who had verified the missing filings. Every page, every document tightened the noose around the HOA's arguments. The judge interrupted at one point, asking the HOA's attorneys to respond to the evidence. They stumbled, claiming clerical errors, dismissing the oversight as minor. But the veteran calmly corrected them, pointing out that the law was explicit. Without the filing, they had no legal standing. What they called clerical error was, in fact, the destruction of their authority. The courtroom grew silent. Each word from the veteran was a blow, and each piece of evidence landed like a hammer striking steel. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence unraveling in front of everyone. Finally, he reached the climax of his case. From the bottom of his binder, he pulled the eviction notice, the one the HOA had posted on his door threatening to seize his home. He placed it on the podium and spoke with calm finality. This, he explained, was signed by an entity that has no legal right to govern, no lawful authority to enforce, and no standing in this court. This notice is not only invalid, it is an attempt to defraud me of my property, and it is the culmination of years of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The judge picked up the notice, studying it carefully. For a long moment she said nothing. The HOA attorneys shifted nervously, The board members whispered among themselves, panic beginning to take root. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was clear and deliberate. She asked the HOA attorneys to explain how their client could exercise authority without the proper filing. They stumbled, citing community reliance, custom, and implied consent. But the judge's expression hardened. Custom was not law, reliance was not authority. Without the filing, they had no ground to stand on. The veteran returned to his seat, his binder empty now, every piece of evidence laid bare before the court. He sat in silence, his hands folded, his eyes steady. He had fired every shot, and the silence in the courtroom told him each one had landed. The HOA's attorneys scrambled, requesting recesses, stalling for time. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and no amount of jargon or delay could cover it. For years, the HOA had operated as if they were untouchable, confident that homeowners would never question their authority. Today, in front of the court, that illusion shattered. By the end of the day, the hearing concluded with the judge announcing she would take the matter under advisement. Her words were careful, measured, but there was no mistaking the weight of what had just unfolded. The HOA had been exposed, their foundation ripped apart, their arrogance turned to dust. As the veteran gathered his things, he caught sight of the board president. The woman who had once stood at community meetings declaring herself the enforcer of order now sat pale and shaken. Her empire had begun to crumble, and she knew it. Walking out of the courtroom, the veteran felt the tension of months finally ease from his shoulders. The war wasn't officially over yet. There would be rulings, filings, and battles still to come. But he knew the tide had turned. The trap he had set was now sprung, and the HOA had fallen straight into it. The courthouse doors opened to bright daylight. He stepped outside, inhaled deeply, and allowed himself the first real smile in months. The HOA had thought they could crush him. Instead, they had walked straight into their own destruction. The weeks that followed the hearing were a storm unlike anything the community had ever seen. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, their board members dictating every detail of life in the neighborhood, from the color of mailboxes to the length of grass. To most homeowners, they had seemed untouchable. But now, whispers spread like wildfire. Word traveled fast that the court had exposed the HOA's fatal flaw. Neighbors who had once paid their fines in silence began to question whether those payments had ever been valid. Homeowners who had been forced to repaint homes, re-landscape yards, or even face foreclosure started to dig through their own records. The realization spread quickly. The board's authority wasn't just shaky, it had been built on sand from the very beginning. At first, the board tried to maintain control. They sent out letters, insisting that the case was ongoing and that operations would continue as normal. But the community no longer believed them. Meetings that had once been sparsely attended suddenly filled with angry residents demanding answers. Some shouted that they wanted their money back. Others called for the board to resign immediately. The once feared HOA president, who used to command the room with sharp glares and a clipped voice, now sat red-faced, drowning beneath a tide of outrage. Meanwhile, the veteran remained calm. He had spent years quietly preparing, enduring the harassment in silence. Now he no longer needed to speak. His victory was unfolding all around him. Every news article, every whispered conversation, every new challenge the board faced was proof that the trap he had set was working exactly as intended. When the judge's final ruling was issued, it landed like a thunderclap. The decision was clear. The HOA had no legal authority. Their failure to properly file decades ago invalidated their claims over the community. All fines, all liens, all foreclosure threats were deemed unlawful. Every enforcement action they had taken was null and void. The ruling did more than vindicate the veteran. It shattered the very foundation of the HOA's existence. The court ordered the HOA to cease operations immediately until proper filings could be completed, a process so lengthy and costly that it was, in effect, the end of their reign. Even worse for the board, The judge left the door open for homeowners to pursue reimbursement for damages, fines, and legal costs. What had once been a weapon the board used against others had now turned against them. The news spread beyond the neighborhood. Local reporters picked up the story, fascinated by the tale of a single man who had brought down an entire HOA through patience, discipline, and legal strategy. Headlines called him a hero. Commentators praised his intelligence. Social media exploded with clips and summaries of the case. Strangers from across the country cheered him on, many of them homeowners who had suffered under HOAs of their own. As attention grew, so did the pressure on the board members. Neighbors they once bullied now treated them with open hostility. Former allies turned on them, demanding repayment and accountability. Lawsuits began to pile up from residents who wanted back every dollar they had been forced to spend under false authority. For the board members, the empire they had built through intimidation collapsed overnight, leaving only shame and debt in its place. The veteran, however, did not celebrate with loud words or grand gestures. He had never been in it for applause. He simply returned to his land, to the home he had defended with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through war. His fields stretched wide and green, untouched by the HOA's harassment now, and for the first time in years, peace settled over the property. He began to receive letters, some from neighbors thanking him for freeing them, others from strangers across the country sharing their own HOA struggles. He responded to each with the same humility, reminding them that the real power came from knowledge and persistence. He had not beaten the HOA with force but with preparation. For the HOA board, the fallout was merciless. One by one, members resigned in disgrace. The president, once so proud and commanding, avoided public appearances altogether. Rumors swirled that she faced personal lawsuits for the damage she had caused. What had once been a position of power now carried only ruin. In the end, the neighborhood changed forever. Without the HOA's grip, homeowners discovered a new sense of freedom. They painted their homes as they pleased, planted gardens without fear of violation letters, and spoke openly about the tyranny they had endured. Where fear once silenced them, now laughter and relief filled the streets. The veteran watched it all quietly. He did not seek control, did not wish to replace the HOA with his own influence. He had fought not for power, but for principle. His land, his rights, his dignity. They were his alone, and he had defended them with everything he had. Months later, when the last lawsuits were settled and the HOA was officially dissolved, he stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the horizon. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. For years, the HOA had believed they owned him, that they could dictate the terms of his life. But in the end, they had only walked into the trap he had set with patience and precision. They had built 120 homes on his land, believing themselves untouchable. But every brick, every foundation, every arrogant threat had only drawn them closer to their downfall. They had not just stolen, they had exposed themselves. And now they were gone. The veteran smiled softly, turning back toward his home. He had won, not with anger, but with wisdom, not with chaos, but with discipline. His struggle had become a story shared across the country, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions could be undone when they underestimated the strength of one determined man. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and peace, at last, was his. This story is more than just a battle between one man and an HOA. It's proof that no matter how powerful or intimidating an organization may seem, they can never take away your rights if you stand firm and fight back. The veteran didn't just protect his land. He protected his dignity, his legacy, and the truth. And in the end, justice prevailed. Remember, courage and patience will always expose corruption. Stand tall, stay informed, and never let anyone silence your voice.